I want to start by reflecting on a scenario. And it goes something like this. The world and Australia have emerged from an emergency and inflation is rampant. Workers are in short supply while unions are aggressive, adding to upward pressure on inflation. Coal-fired power stations are struggling to stay open and power shortages have become endemic. Population growth, including immigration, is running hot and housing shortages are being felt across the country. The government is making serious market interventions and threatening more, blaming business for many of these failings. The Liberal opposition is proposing more freedoms, less government, lower inflation, more housing, and a more reliable supply of electricity. This scenario is not 2023. It's 1949. The recently formed Liberal Party is being led by Robert Menzies. Menzies is preparing for an election and believes the values of his new party can provide the toolkit for the times. His emphasis is on freedom and choice for individuals and enterprises, personal responsibility, private home ownership, while fighting creeping communism and socialism. Menzies' pitch resonated with Australians ready to move on from the era of big government during and following the Second World War. His win began 23 years of stable government, unprecedented growth, and widespread prosperity. Those years saw productivity gains driving real wage increases never seen before and not seen since. Aspirational Australians were able to get ahead. Now, history may not repeat, but so much of this story is still relevant today. Indeed, the more you examine Australian history, the more the political and economic impact of high inflation and big government becomes clear. There have been three major prolonged periods of climbing and stubborn inflation since World War II. The post-war reconstruction, when inflation rose from 2.5% in 1947 to 9.3% in 1950. 1972 to 1975, where inflation rose from 4.7% to almost 18%. And many will, including myself, I remember those days. Inflation then rose to a peak of 9.6%, almost 10% in December 1986, followed by another spike in late 1995. Each of these events, each one of them ultimately led to eras of smaller government, greater freedoms, with a strong focus on enterprise and productivity reform. For instance, in the 1949 event, the post-war reconstruction, Menzies came into power promising to support the ambitious enterprise of the individual, This followed those repeated interventions from the Chifley government to entrench wartime economic powers, including a referendum to give pricing powers to the Commonwealth, culminating in the final rejection of the plan to nationalise the banks in the late 40s. 1975, Whitlam's massive expansion of the state, starting in 1972, leading to sharp increases of inflation, paving the way for Fraser to promise a retreat from Labor's excesses. 1996, Howard came into government after a fresh spike of inflation, and the long tail of the 1990s recession finally broke Australians' confidence in Labor. And 2013, while a significant inflationary surge didn't precede the 2013 election, Tony Abbott came to power following a massive growth in government during the global financial crisis, increases in unemployment, uncontrolled borders, rising energy prices, and big government interventions, including Labor's mining and carbon taxes. Now, in all of these cases, the issues were consistent. Australians, after a period of big government, wanted less government and better government, not more. Australia's or Labor's agendas had delivered over time some combination of rampant inflation and a sluggish economy. And the Liberals offered an agenda freeing Australia from these constraints. It's noticeable that voters only gave governments a small window to get back on track when economic troubles hit. Australians are fair-minded, and that's a good thing. But when government fails to address the real threats to Australia's economic security, voters will act. But throughout history, and throughout that history I've described just in the last few minutes, we've learned that inflation changes governments. The experience of Chifley, Whitlam, Keating and the Rudd-Gillard governments should be a warning shot to Labor governments that want to pursue their traditional agendas. But Liberals should remember that ultimately voters did not forgive Malcolm Fraser for the second oil shock and the subsequent increase in unemployment in the 1980s as well. So it cuts both ways. And this is why government needs to treat inflation as its first, second and third priority.